Bible, turn to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1 will be there this morning. You know, it was great to have Nathan Wagner up here reading scripture, and I was talking to him and the Mitchells not too long ago, the Mitchell boys, and they explained to me that it's football season now, and that I needed to make sure that the sermon was over in time for everybody to go watch the Titans game. And so I checked, and they play tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. And so I hope you guys brought a snack. Just kidding. But yeah, we're in Romans today. And we've been calling this series Strengthening the Core, Great Themes from Romans. That's my way of saying that next week we won't be picking up in chapter 2, we'll be picking up in chapter 3, because I'm trying to hit the great themes of Romans during the fall. But we found ourselves in the first chapter of Romans for 3 straight weeks. And I wanted to remind you about the book of Romans and what Paul is doing when he writes this wonderful book. He is writing it to the political capital of the world, where the emperor is in charge of everything, but the emperor is also worshiped as a god. It's the epicenter of everything political. It's also the epicenter of everything economic. If you're worried about finances, you turn to Rome. If you're looking to be bailed out after an earthquake, you turn to Rome. If you need money, it's the Roman emperor whose image is on the coin. And if you want to be where all the shakers and the movers are, you move to Rome. And so it's in that context that the Apostle Paul writes this letter on his third missionary journey. And I tried to say to you all that the Apostle Paul was the first great theologian of the church. He had a mind that would be admired at any time. He was the clerk to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Our good friend Kenneth Starr passed away this week. And as I was reading his bio, I noticed that he clerked for Justice Berger. And it was something that happens for people who have an incredibly bright mind. And Paul was advancing beyond any of his friends as far as the mind that he had. But when he gave his life to Christ, he began to take that great mind and he began to explore the Christian faith and the depths of it. And in his writings that we call the letters of Paul, we begin to see his work. And Romans is the most extensive working out of the Christian faith. And so last week we looked at this verse, and I wanted to invite you to recite it with me again this week. And if you don't mind, let's stand and let's recite this verse. And I think you can make your way through it with me. So here we go. You ready? For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Have a seat. So that's this amazing text in Romans that tells us that Paul is not ashamed of the gospel. He sees the gospel as the power of God, the dynamite, the dunamis of God. This gospel is what unleashes the power of God in a dark world. And this word for the power of God for salvation, I want us to understand salvation in this term means deliverance. It means that the gospel is the power of God to deliver people from the human condition. It's the only way out of the mess that we find ourselves in. And when we come to Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, we begin to ask ourselves, what is the present human condition? And if you were going to describe the human condition today, how would you describe it? What is going on here? Do you find yourself saying that quite often? What is going on? How did that happen? What's going on around here? I hear it constantly because we're all wondering, how have we made such a mess of this? I loved what former Secretary Madeleine Albright said. She said, to put it mildly, the world is a mess. And that's just kind of the way it is. But if you think back to the very beginning and you read Genesis 1:31, what you read about what God designed is that God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. So very good has become a holy hot mess. And we have to ask ourselves, how did that happen? How have things gotten where they are today? Well, look in Romans chapter 1 and verse 18, and we'll see in this section that we're looking at today, what Paul says is the reason that things have gotten so off, that they're not the way that they're supposed to be. In verse 18, he describes the situation this way. He says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress. How do you suppress? You push down, you contract. Have you ever done that with a picture on your computer? You take it, you copy it, and then it's got that square around it with the little circles at certain places, and you can push it in and push it in, and you can take something and you can make it smaller and smaller and smaller. And then if you really want to suppress it, you can figure out how to hide it somewhere as well. But here, Paul says that the wrath of God, the anger of God, is being poured out because of wickedness. And I wanted us to understand that this word for the wrath of God that I wanted you to see was also part of the gospel in 1 Thessalonians, that the wrath of God here, this word, is the word orge. And all it simply means is the building up, the swelling, the boiling over of the anger of God. It's not like Zeus who gets mad in a moment and just starts throwing lightning bolts. This has been sweltering, it's been building up, it's been coming to a boil. And God has just watched long enough. He's had it with this. And so the wrath of God is now being revealed against all godlessness and wickedness, and against those who suppress the truth, who hide the truth, who minimize the truth, who make the truth of God less than what it ought to be. And so what I wanted us to ask right off the bat is, what does it mean to suppress truth? How do you make it smaller? Leo Tolstoy said this. He said, very often, all the activity of the human mind is directed not in revealing the truth, but in hiding the truth. If you watch the news at all today, you're scratching your head. Where's the truth? How do we even know what the truth is when it seems like everybody's trying to hide it, suppress it, craft it to fit their story? And Paul is saying people have been suppressing the truth for a long, long time. The truth is what sets us free, but the truth can be easily hidden. I remember when I was a kid, I would go to the doctor's office, and while I was waiting for my time to go inside and see the doctor, there was this magazine called Highlights, I think it was called, and you could flip into it and you would find this thing that had a picture, and you were supposed to find all the little things that were hidden in that picture. And one of the things that happens as we suppress the truth is that it just begins to blend in to everything else that is going on. And when that happens, the truth ends up becoming a truth. And what I want us to see today is that's what the Apostle Paul says is idolatry. Is when the truth ceases to be the truth and becomes a truth that's mingled with everything else. So let's look at the text. If you have your Bible, Romans 1, verse 18. We've looked at it, but now I want us to see that Paul's going to lay out for us in this piece of the passage the God path, the idol path, and the end result. And I don't think this is like the most warm and fuzzy sermon that you're going to hear, but you sometimes need to hear, this is Paul. He's unpacking and setting up everything else, and he wants us to understand the human condition as it really is today, okay? I'll try to make you feel good on the way out, but I do want us to understand that Paul is trying to say, this thing's a mess, and here's why, okay? And so, let's look at the God path. Beginning in verse 19, we read these words. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So what Paul says is that God has made himself plainly known. God has shown himself to us in his creation. And that if you were a reasonable person and you looked at the creation, you would come to the conclusion that behind the creation is a creator, one who makes it all happen. When Paul was on Mars Hill and he was proclaiming the good news there in Acts chapter 17, he said these words to the wisest of the wise according to Greek philosophy. He said, God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. And that literally was a way of, for Paul saying is, God's at the tip of your nose if you'll just look for him. He's not hard to see if you'll just open your eyes. And so what Paul says here in verse 19 is that God has invisible attributes. And God's invisible attributes can be clearly perceived if you want to perceive them. What are those invisible attributes? His eternal power and his divine nature. Well, what does eternal power mean? You woke up this morning. Did gravity work today? Yep. Did the sun rise today? Yep. Is it going to get hotter as the day goes on? Yep. Did you water something yesterday? Did it grow today? Yep. Is that going to happen again tomorrow? Unless the Lord comes back? There's something that's making this thing work. And it worked yesterday, and it worked today, and we have really good confidence it's going to work tomorrow. Because there is somebody who is making this thing happen. It's God's eternal power. And God's divine nature is the fact that when you look at this world and you're blown away by how beautiful it is, or you look up into the heavens and you see the stars. By the way, I don't call it space. You know what space implies? It's vast and empty. You know why the Bible doesn't call it space? It calls it the heavens. It's because it's the place where if you're looking, you'll see God. And Paul was saying that the eternal power of God and the divine nature of God is clearly seen if you'll just open your eyes and you will look. You know, there were no people who claimed to be atheists until about the 1600s. Atheism is a pretty new phenomenon. You'd just be called a fool for most of the history of the world if you claimed, I don't believe there's a God. People would say, what's wrong with you? How do you think this happened? How do you think this happened? What makes this happen? Why does this happen? Why do the rains fall? Why do the seasons change? Why do things grow? Why do we eat? Why is the water okay? Why do the oceans only go so far? They'd ask question after question. They'd say, how could you possibly come to the conclusion that there is no God? Amen. And so, Paul says, it's plainly seen so that no one has an excuse. It ought to be clear to you. So that's the God path. God has made himself known, his eternal power, his divine nature, clearly seen. No one has an excuse. But the idol path. But although they knew God, they neither glorified him nor gave thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Instead of honoring the God who created it all, it's going to happen again tomorrow whether I honor him or not. The food's going to come whether I thank him or not. And people began to quit honoring God. They quit seeing God as the ultimate provider. They quit seeing God as the one that we needed to say thank you to. There's a scene at the beginning of Shenandoah where they're sitting down to eat as a family. And you might remember the father sitting at the end of the table and he's about to start eating. And the mom, the wife, says, hey, we got to pray before we eat. And so he says, okay, I'll pray. Dear God, thank you for this food that I planted, that I've tended to, that I harvested, that I brought to this table. Amen. And we get that way, don't we? Where we forget that God is the one to be honored and God is the one to be thanked. And what happens is our hearts become foolish and hardened when we're not grateful to the one who has given us so much. So Paul goes on to say, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him nor thanked him. They became futile in their thinking and foolish in their hearts. Do we see a lot of that today? Futile thinking, foolish hearts, not honoring God, not thanking God as being the one behind it all, claiming to be wise. They became fools. And they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and even birds and animals and creeping things. They claimed that they had a wisdom that the rest of us didn't have. But when you looked at what they were doing, the emperor had no clothes. It didn't work. And they exchanged the real God for images. You know, the word for somebody who believes in God is a theist. Or the belief in God is called theism. You've probably heard that before. And if you approach a thesaurus and you ask about what's the opposite of theism, here are the words that would be used: atheism, godlessness, disbelief, doubt, skepticism, unbelief, distrust, misgiving, denial. But you know what's interesting? If you read the text that we just read, the opposite of theism is idolatry. The opposite of theism, Paul says, is idolatry. It's when you exchange the truth of God for a lie and you begin to worship animals and birds and reptiles. Idolatry is the opposite of believing in God. And so here's the end result. You ready? Verse 24. Therefore, God gave them up. God says, you want to worship this stuff? You want to run in this direction? You're going to have a dark mind and you're going to run after foolish things? He gave them up to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creatures rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. Amen. God gave them up because they worshiped the wrong thing. How does that happen? You know, it's easy for us to look at the other side of the world and for us to scratch our head and to ask, how could people worship things that they crafted with their own hands, that they put on a float and they carried out into the water? How could they possibly exchange the worship of something that they created with their own hands for the Creator in the heavens? We scratch our head when we look at them and we think, how could they possibly do that? But if we were honest and we understood that if a sociologist came and looked at us, they would scratch their head and ask, how is it that they worship so many things? How is it that money and fame and appearance and popularity and power and influence have so taken hold of them? How is it that social media so dominates their life that they bow down and worship this little thing in their hands that they know was created by somebody in Silicon Valley? They'd ask the same thing about us. How did they get to that point? This summer, Suzanne and I got to go to Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. Here's a picture of Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. It's over 2 miles long. It's one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. And now you've seen a picture of it, so you don't need to go there. Is that right? Do you feel less inclined to go there now that I've shown you this picture? You would if you exchanged the creature for the Creator. But if you ever get to go there and you ever get to hike the falls and you get to see it and you get to hear it and you get to experience it and you're just, you have to wear a raincoat because of the power of the water coming flooding down upon you. And you stand there and you realize God is awesome. And what Paul says is, instead of worshiping, honoring, and thanking an awesome God, they satisfy themselves with pictures. It's like people who go to a football game and they're sitting there in the stadium watching the game on the scoreboard. And that's what we're doing. We're missing God because we're worshiping the creature. And so the rest of Romans says God gave them over to lust. God gave them over, of Romans chapter 1, of lust, of debased minds, and they now misrepresent God to others as well. There's more I could say here, and Jeff, correct me if my date is wrong. But I'm going to actually teach a lunch and learn after church on Sunday, October the 2nd. From 11:30 to 1, and we'll start advertising this next week. But I'll give you about an hour and a half. You'll be able to sign up for a lunch, and while you're eating, I'll walk you through about 90 minutes of material on what would Jesus' response be to homosexuality, which is really what the rest of Romans chapter 1 picks as the ultimate example of idolatry. And what Paul lays out is the case that idolatry and the way that you see that in homosexuality leads to what he says in chapter 2, which is that you're all guilty of sin. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And that example is a microcosm of what everybody's doing. But I'll lay that out for you if you'd like to come and be a part of that seminar, and we'll be answering some things about that this week. But what I wanted us to notice is that there is this tendency in the life of every one of us to exchange the truth of God for something far less than God. And so here are a few thoughts as we close. Don't be ashamed of the gospel. Remember that Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. For in it, the gospel, The power of God is revealed by faith. And what we need to understand is that nothing else can deliver on its promise except for the power of God that is displayed in Jesus Christ. And we've got to just keep coming back to the fact that there is nothing else that satisfies. There's nothing else that you can chase after that will satisfy. I've done something. Could you move to the next slide for me? Did I turn this off or something? Next slide. There we go. The world is hopelessly lost without Jesus. If you believe that, turn to the person next to you and tell them that. It would help for you to articulate those words yourself, if you believe them. The world is hopelessly lost without Jesus. That's what Paul's trying to tell us in Romans chapter 1. How does that make you feel? To know that the world is hopelessly lost without Jesus. Paul's trying to say that the wrath of God is being revealed on all those who choose godlessness and wickedness. But Jesus is the power of God to deliver us from all of that. And there is nothing else that can do that. And so we have to realize that this gift that's been given to us of telling other people about Jesus is not something to take lightly. The world desperately needs Jesus. In Genesis 1, 26 and 27, God said, "Let us make mankind in our image." That's the story of Genesis chapter 1, is that we were made in the image of God. But the story that is told in the New Testament, and Paul summarizes in Colossians 1, verse 15, is that God then looked at this world that was wicked and godless and hopelessly lost, and he said, "Let us make God in man's image." And Jesus entered into the world, and Paul says he entered into the world as the image of the invisible God. The only image that has ever set foot on earth that's worthy of being worshiped is the image of the invisible God given to us in Jesus the Christ. And so, we ask ourselves, how do I suppress the truth? Where does idolatry get hold of me? I need to tell you that the last words of 1 John, written to believers, written to Christians, says, "Dear children, guard yourselves from idols." That's how the book ends. Dear children, guard yourselves from idols. And we need to watch ourselves. Do I honor God? Do I give Him thanks? Or have I taken the truth and suppressed it? The truth about Jesus has to be the lens through which we see everything else, or else everything else becomes idolatry. C.S. Lewis, of course, says it all much better than I could in a single sentence when he says it this way: "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." If you want your life to make sense, you've got to let Jesus be the center of it all. And you've got to honor the Creator. You've got to thank the Creator. And you've got to be someone who is sold out to worship the one who gave you everything. Some people will settle to worship images this week. We will only settle to worship the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For it's in Him that everything makes sense, and it is He who holds everything together. And so we worship Him this morning. If you need to give your life to Him, if you need to publicly confess or get right with Him, this is the time to do it. We're not in a hurry. The Titans don't play till 7 o'clock tomorrow. But we do want to get right with God. And some of us might just need to say, you know what, this phone, this TikTok, this Instagram, this whatever it is, has really gotten out of control. That's why I challenge my students in my Bible class to fast from their phone at least one day a week. Just turn it off. Don't bow down to it. For many of us, we need to put our Bible on top of our phone. We need to say, I'm going to read this before I look at that. I'm going to honor this before I honor that. I'm going to thank God before I get consumed with all of this. But we've got to be people who are disciplined, because the idols of our age are after us. They are principalities and powers, and they want us. So let's give all we have to King Jesus. And if we can minister to you in any way, come to the front as we stand and sing this song together.
Oh, what a